This is from Jerry in our Discord. Lately, I've been thinking about how I used to spend my free time when I was a kid. I've been heavily reducing my phone usage, and I'm trying to think of more ways that I've relaxed or entertained myself in the past before smartphones.
Yeah, and I think the way we're going to take this is to sort of talk about boredom and how that used to be a thing that happened 10 or 15 years ago. I've spent the past couple weeks, we've been working up to this and off and on talking about phone usage and trying to keep that to a minimum and whatnot. But I really was very hardcore about this the past couple weeks. I've stripped off anything even remotely interesting from my phone. So I just have Discord is the most interesting thing on there. Uh, Mostly though, it's just messaging. There's no browser. There's no social media. There's no Twitch or YouTube or anything. So that's been a big source of, or a big way to induce boredom, in that I just don't have a lot to do with the phone. So I've been bored the past couple weeks, and I've been thinking about it a lot. Uh, how about you? I mean, you use the light phone, so in terms of phone usage, you're kind of ahead of the curve with that. Uh, but you're also busier than I am, so I don't know if you've had as much time to be bored.
Well, that is true. Actually, the last month or so, things have gotten so busy and so crazy. I've had something to do on every single weekend for like the past month and a half, and then we had this big convention at work, and then I got put on this project that's just insane, and I don't know, a bunch of things. I've been super stressed and busy. So really, I kind of snapped after trying to keep up with all my art stuff and all of that. I just sort of snapped on my free time, and I decided to kind of take an intentional break from that on my free time.
Okay.
So, and then when we brought this topic up, like, okay, I'm just gonna lean into this boredom thing where I'm putting everything else on hold, uh, and I'm just gonna see what happens, and I'm not gonna feel bad about it. I'm
Mhm.
just gonna see what my brain does when I'm not doing the things that I normally would do or that I feel like I need to do. So yeah, I've also been leaning into this, and it has taken me to some weird places. Um,
Uh, yeah, same. I started knitting this week.
Jesus, okay.
Yeah. So the other thing that happened was I sold my Steam Deck, which is kind of like a PC version of a Nintendo Switch, like a handheld gaming thing. And I'd been using that a lot, just to sit on the couch and play games and stuff. And I love it. I use it very frequently. It was like a kind of the wind down thing in the evenings for me. And I sold it because I wanted a newer, better one. But I sold it and then ordered the new one, and the new one is taking forever to get here. So there's like a big gap of where I
Yeah.
don't have this thing that I was using a lot. So it ended up cutting out gaming for me, almost entirely. I play at the PC sometimes, but not that much lately. So there's just been this big kind of hole of, most evenings I would sit down and play some games, and now that's just not there. So it was this big vacuum of, okay, what do I do now? And my wife started crocheting and was making stuff, and she was just sitting on the couch crocheting for hours. And I was thinking, that's pretty chill. I kind of like that. And so I bought some knitting needles and some yarn and started knitting. And it's boring. It's like real boring. But we started watching TV, and we've been watching the final seasons of House, so that's been kind of fun. But outside of that, it's been a lot of boredom. And one of the, I don't know if we want to start getting into it yet or not, but one of the things I've noticed about being bored is that you're in this state where you aren't being entertained or stimulated at the level that you want to be. If you're doing something exciting, you're not bored. If you're scrolling through Instagram, you're not bored. But, when there's just nothing there, you're bored. And when you're bored, you want to find something. Like it's at least the way I define it is like this state of feeling a little bit unsatisfied with the level of entertainment or stimulation coming in, where you're like, I really wish something would entertain me. And so when you're in that state, you kind of naturally look for stuff to fill that hole that's like just what your mind is trying to do. So if you're stuck somewhere and you don't have a phone or something like that, that's very entertaining. Uh, at least what I notice is that I start to explore my immediate environment a little bit. Like I'll start to, click buttons on my watch. I'll start to notice that, oh, I have like a loose thread, or hey, my shoe is dirty and I should clean this up. Like you just start to notice little things and you start to seek out entertainment. And so on a slightly larger scale than even just exploring your clothing and whatnot, when you're bored, you start to look for stuff that you wouldn't have looked for otherwise. So in my case, because of this big hole in my day where I just have nothing entertaining to do, I start to think, what can I do? And I start to look. And weirdly enough, one of the things I discovered was knitting, and I started knitting, which is never something I would have tried. But it's an interesting side effect of being bored, in that the boredom is what motivated me to like look for things that I might not have otherwise.
So let's back up a little bit. Um, I feel like in recent years, boredom has sort of become a, I don't know, a trendy word to use, especially in productivity stuff. It's like, oh, you need to be bored. Being bored is good. Being bored will solve all of your problems.
Yeah.
And I think, not that I disagree, but I think there's more there, and I'm sure other people describe that there is more there. But if you think about boredom itself, it's not knowing what to do. And not knowing what to do doesn't really lead to anything good. I mean, in itself.
Yeah.
It's just a state of nothingness. And that's not good. So when we talk about boredom being good, or when anybody talks about boredom being good, I think they're talking about what happens after that state. So what you don't want, I don't think, is a perpetual state of boredom all the time, because that sucks. That's dumb. Like nothing happens when you're really bored.
Right.
So the way I've been thinking about boredom is not so much as, such a wonderful thing in itself. It's sort of like a four-way stop, right in the center of a four-way stop. And what you have behind you is Sleep Street, right? So you could turn back and go to sleep, right? Because you're in the middle of this four-way stop and you have to make a decision of where to go. You're not currently moving, you're just standing still. So behind you is Sleep Street. You go back to bed, take a nap, whatever, give up. It's a wonderful, cozy street with a beautiful cottage or something. And then to the right is your phone, your computer, any sort of scrolling or very safe place to be that you kind of just pull into the parking lot and everything's taken care of. And yeah, it's a nice street, but it doesn't really go anywhere. It's just sort of a roundabout or something.
Yeah.
Or you could go further, or you could go straight ahead. And that leads into town. The familiar town that you live, or you recognize everything in that town. You can go hang out with friends, that or you go do all of the things that you're supposed to be doing, or that you recognize, or that you could play your Steam game, although that might be in the parking lot. But you go work on your art, you go do all the things that you recognize and know you should do, or whatever. And then there's this fourth street, which is this creepy, abandoned, overgrown, strange street, the unknown street that doesn't have a name. And I think in our day-to-day rituals and routines, we completely overlook that street and we choose to never go down it, especially in the last 10, 15 years, because there's just no reason for us to go down there.
Yeah.
But if you turn left and go down that scary street, you end up it you could end up somewhere wonderful, or you could end up somewhere not so wonderful. I mean, it's a very strange place to wander through. Um, you might find something like knitting, okay, which is nice and safe, or you might find yourself, letting your mind wander, and it brings up past traumas or weird things from the past. I mean, it could lead anywhere. And I think when people talk about boredom being a good thing, actually being a necessary thing, I think what they're talking about is boredom is that state where you're right in the center of the four-way stop. But the things that are good that come from boredom is when you are able to make a decision that is different than your recognizable streets of the safety to the right or sleep or the recognizable things. But when you go to a new place and start wandering around, different things happen. And that used to be a natural thing that would happen to humans all the time when we were primitive. But even up until 10, 15 years ago, we had lots of time to start wandering around and go exploring. And in the last 10, 15 years, that road becomes more and more overgrown, and we go towards the safety of the other roads. So I don't know if that's too far out there, but that's
No.
kind of how I've been thinking about it.
So, well, okay, there's a handful of things I want to talk about there. The first is that I don't know if I totally agree that boredom itself is not useful, because I think there
Well,
are some upsides to it.
okay. I think as soon as you start running into the good things about boredom, you're sort of out of boredom. Uh, that's what I think anyway, is that
Well,
all the good things, like, oh, your mind starts wandering and then you find something interesting. Well, then you're outside of boredom because you're not bored anymore. Right?
okay. Well, let me ask you this. Do you think you'd be better off just without accounting for the four-way stop and what streets you wind up going to, whatever, like forget that. If you spend an hour being bored or an hour scrolling through TikTok, which is better or worse for you?
Obviously, the boredom, because the boredom would lead to
No.
something.
It doesn't matter what it leads to.
Okay,
There's no
just
there's no
total
other
boredom.
thing. Yeah, you have a busy schedule. Every minute of your day is booked except for 1 hour, and during that hour, you sit down and are bored out of your mind, or you scroll through TikTok the whole time.
Okay. The positive there with that boredom, where even if you don't end up on anything more interesting, is that it at least gives your brain some time to relax.
Uh-huh.
And okay, all right. I see that. Whereas if you're scrolling through TikTok or whatever, you are training your brain to constantly need entertainment and satisfaction. The boredom makes you a bit stronger and more adept at handling longer periods of time. Okay, all right.
I mean, look, I remember being a kid.
It's like a detox. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I hate to throw out the term dopamine detox because
I hate for you to do
everyone's
that too, but yeah.
right, just because it's popular and so that makes it annoying. But I remember being a kid. I want to acknowledge your point here. I remember being a kid and being bored out of my mind almost every day. And it
Yeah.
wasn't because I was a kid. It was because when I was a kid, we didn't have smartphones and barely had the internet. Like I remember when we got 28K modem that you had to like ask your mom to get off the phone so you could get on the internet, and it was horrifyingly slow. Like that's I was bored because that's when I was a kid. Or I was bored as a kid because that's when I was a kid. I remember being bored out of my mind so often. I remember as a kid thinking that 1 hour was an unimaginably long time because I remember being bored and trying to wait for an hour to pass was just torture. It felt like an eternity captured inside that hour. Now, an hour is nothing because I'm constantly entertained. But it was not as if my life was wonderful and roses and I was entirely healthy and free of bad things. It's not like boredom was the key to happiness. I still got upset and anxious and depressed and frustrated and all of those things. So I think there is a big romanticization of boredom now. You can go watch TED Talks of people talking about how the secret to life and everything is being bored and how it totally resets your brain. And I don't think so, because things weren't that great as a kid.
Right.
But I do think that there are some major upsides to boredom, even on its own, just as its own thing. And probably more so than that, to me, boredom is a symptom of the environment that you're in. And when you're never bored, that's just indicating that you're in a very high stimulation environment. And I think that there are some major downsides to that. I think like huge downsides to that. So, in a sense, you're saying boredom might not be that great. It's more what happens after or whatever. But I think when you compare it to scrolling for an hour on TikTok, you can't really separate the argument out. You can't say that, well, boredom itself isn't that great, but scrolling through TikTok for an hour is bad for you, because boredom is the absence of those things. So in a sense, you're saying not doing that for an hour is good for you. That's boredom, because boredom is the choice or this situation where you aren't doing the other stuff that makes you not bored. Does that was a stupid argument, but do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
I get it. I, I, do you think it's better to be bored for an hour or to do something mentally challenging and engaging and healthy for you for an hour?
That's a good question. Um
I mean, it's a weird thing to talk about because the lines of boredom itself are not super well defined, I think,
right.
anyway. But yeah, answer that question.
I think that when you are bored, the amount of stimulation that your mind is getting is not meeting what it wants. And I think that I'm going to answer your question. I'm not just going to dodge it, but it's going to be slow. So I think that situation is good, because the way I think of it is like your mind has some level of stimulation that it wants. And if the amount of stimulation that you're getting is higher than that, then that level of want will start to drift upwards towards the amount that you're getting. So if you're, doing something very stimulating, and, TikTok and that kind of stuff is like, that's what that is. We've spent many years and trillions of dollars researching how to make the most stimulating thing. If you're doing that, very entertaining, tons of novelty, super, super short, like context window, constant context switching, that level of stimulation is really high. And so in your mind, like the amount that you want starts to follow that level. So it drifts up and up. And then when you take that away and you're like, okay, now I got to go to work. I got to do my taxes now and focus on one very uninteresting thing for a long period of time. That level of stimulation drops a lot, and your mind is like, oh, I hate this. This sucks. This is not what I want. So when you're bored, that level of stimulation is lower than what you want, because you're, like, at least in the way that I define it, you're like kind of looking for something. You don't really feel content with the amount that you're getting. But because that's lower than the amount you're craving, that level will start to drop. I mean, to me, that's what's happening when you're bored on some level, is that the amount of stimulation you're craving is coming down. So that, I think, is of huge benefit, because if you can get to where you aren't craving a high level of stimulation, then you can focus and you can relax. And I think that there are some pretty nasty symptoms of needing a very high level of stimulation all the time. In particular, ADHD like symptoms and depression and anxiety for sure, and it affects your ability to sleep. I mean, I genuinely think, and there's plenty of evidence for this, that it's really bad for your health. And certainly your mental health. So boredom, I think, has a big benefit there, in that it is a throttling down of the amount of stimulation that you're craving. Now, that's not the only thing that can work that way. If you do something that's a low level of stimulation but still entertaining, so for me, knitting and watching a TV show that I've already seen like 4 times, it's entertaining, but it's also a lower level of stimulation than, gaming or scrolling on the internet and stuff. And so, there is some level, I think, of throttling down there too. And it's not quite as painful as just staring at a wall. So
Right.
anyway, that to me, like, that's the benefit of being bored. Spending an hour working on something that is mentally stimulating, but let's say like in a good way, it's challenging, it's pushing you a little bit, you're applying yourself, you're maybe accomplishing something that you want to accomplish. Obviously that has a lot of value, and we prioritize that a lot. But even though it's healthy, it's kind of like eating a healthy meal versus a bunch of junk food or Halloween candy, right? Like spending your mental energy on that versus scrolling around on the internet. There is still a cost in terms that it can be fatiguing. And I think on some level, it is still an amount of stimulation that might be higher than baseline. So if you do that all the time, I mean, you can become workaholic type where you just can't get away from work, and that can be detrimental to your life and things like that. So I can't really say either or. I think obviously being able to apply yourself mentally is very key, but I think you need the recovery. Like, you need to at some point be bored, because that is what really allows, your brain to relax and lower that stimulation level. It's kind of like saying, is it more important to uh like do a set of bench press or to do 3 minutes of rest? Like,
Right.
you can't do sets all the time with no rest. You'll hurt yourself and it's counterproductive. But the rest itself isn't like, they both work together. And so you need both of them appropriately timed. That makes sense?
Yeah, that's fair. I also think there are some activities that I would label as uh, or put into the category of boredom. But I don't know, like you doing knitting and watching a TV show. That's real low key. Although the end
House is
seasons of
not
House,
low key.
no,
Yeah,
it's
we're
not
on
low key.
season 8. It's pretty rough.
Yeah, I know you're pretty into that because it's a great show. So I don't know if I would label those activities as
Right.
boredom activities. Uh, Knitting maybe, but and for me, you're talking about boredom and lowering the attention or the entertainment
Yep.
level that you desire, whatever. To me, I could sometimes before I go to bed or something for a half hour or an hour or whatever, I'll read a book or just chill, no electronics, whatever. And that to me kind of falls into that same category of, it's not super stimulating and it's not
Mm-hmm.
like I'm scrolling or whatever. And sometimes it's sort of hard to continue reading because, I just expect more entertainment or whatever. But it's very relaxing. And I feel like it gives me that lowering of entertainment level that I'm often at. So, but it's still an activity. And I don't know, maybe I'm just splitting hairs here, but I mean, how often are you 100% totally bored out of your mind and using that in your daily life? Like, you know,
Yeah, it's not a lot. I mean, well, okay, let's take another step back for a second. So I was kind of talking about boredom as if it's this thing that lowers your level of stimulation and whatever. And I think that's part of it. But the other part of it is that I would define boredom as, if you're reading a book, and no, it's not mind blowing, it's very low key, it's relaxing, but your mind is doing something. You're reading through a story and picturing the things that are happening and whatnot. So your mind is occupied. So I don't know that I would call that boredom. I mean, I gave the example of knitting and watching House because I just wanted to say that I think that there are being bored is not the only way to lower your level of stimulation, right? But if your mind is occupied, I don't know that I would call that boredom. To me, being bored is one, you aren't getting the amount of stimulation that you're craving, and then two, your mind is free to want to be doing something else or to be thinking about things or whatever. You know, your mind is not being occupied. So if you consider that as part of the definition, then reading a book is not being bored necessarily. You might get bored of reading the book where your mind no longer really wants to be on the book, but I wouldn't call that a state of boredom. So there is still a distinction there, I think, between low key activity and outright boredom, where you just really aren't doing anything interesting.
Let's look at how different life is now from before,
Okay.
and why it is that we as humans are never bored anymore. For me, I I mean I've since switching to the light phone, and I still have to switch to my smartphone pretty often for many different reasons. But in terms of overall phone usage, I mean, I probably went from like 3 to 4 hours down to less than an hour um, in a day, and that is just like Spotify,
Yeah.
pretty much. So I don't use a phone really at all, unless I'm editing a video or recording stuff. But really, in terms of scrolling, it's not really there. Um, so I've made great progress on that. But if I compare my life now to where it was when I was in high school or something, it's an entirely different world where
Hmm.
I have a computer right in my room where you sit down, and the general routine is to just sit down at the computer, turn it on, and then, something comes to you and finds you, entertains you. Um, Same with the phone, although not so much anymore. But um, and then in the car, I mean, you're not even looking for a CD to put in the
Hmm.
player. It's just like hooks to your phone or whatever. It just immediately starts entertaining you. I mean, and then TVs in every room. I mean, there's no place in modern life for any sort of boredom or wandering or
Yeah.
thinking.
I remember Netflix back when I don't think he's CEO anymore. Reed Hastings was talking about Netflix, and this was like the rise of Netflix when they had got into streaming. Nobody else was in streaming, and it was just starting to just explode. But he was saying that Netflix isn't competing with other services. You know, it's not now that's not really true anymore, but at the time this was true. That Netflix isn't competing with HBO or, traditional cable or anything. It's competing with going outside or going to a restaurant with your friends. The goal was not to get you to choose Netflix over other services. It was to choose Netflix over everything else in your life. And that's what they were after. And you can see that in one, the shows that they put out, but also, the interface. You can't even stop for a second before it starts playing a trailer and then just starts playing a show, and it just wants to suck you in so desperately that you get like 3 seconds after an episode is over to click the button before it plays the next one. Like they want you on
Right.
there all the time, every second of the day. But that is what they're after, and that's not just Netflix. I mean, he said it the most plainly of anyone I've heard, but that is the case with every social media site and service out there, is that the objective is to get you to spend every single waking second on their service. That's what they want. They want the maximum possible number of usage minutes that can be had. And so what that boils down to is competing with everything else, trying to make you never bored. Anytime you have any inclination for entertainment, they want you going there to put your eyeballs on their side to ultimately view ads. I mean, that's or to pay for their service. That's what they're after. So it is no accident that we live in a world, like you're saying, where there is never even an opportunity to be bored unless you force it to happen, or exotic situations that rarely come up. It used to be you couldn't use a phone on an airplane. There was no internet, but they fixed that. Don't worry. You don't
Right.
have to be off your phone when you're on an airplane now. Like all of that is taken care of. Uh, I don't know. Maybe you have a court date or something. They'll make you put away your phone, but it hardly ever happens. So there's been just, like I said, trillions of dollars and massive effort. I mean, the biggest industry on earth is tech, and its main goal is to make sure that if there is even the slightest gap in your life, you're going to spend it, you know, doing this stuff. So yeah, the world is just massively different in that way.
The thing that I find even creepier is that you don't even notice it.
Yeah.
I've spent some time, and this is what Jerry's comment was, is thinking back to when you know, how you used to spend your free time as a kid. And it's hard. It's actually really hard to think back to the sort of daily activities you did as a kid or a young adult or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to remember how much time you had to be bored or to just explore things, try new things, or spend time thinking or sitting and listening to music or whatever. I mean, it's weird because I never noticed the change happening. I never noticed the evolution of all of the
Mm-hmm.
tech and everything. It just, you know, happens one little thing at a time. Before you know it, you're 15 years later and the whole world is completely different and you're a different person, and it just creeps in and it's so simple. Um, but you just don't notice it. And no one really, well, I mean, people do now, but no one really sits down and compares their life to what they had, you know, a decade ago to what they have now. It's just sort of part of your daily routines. Even in the last year, my job has upped, or in the last 2 or 3 years, they have upped the amount that is expected from you, um, from them on your phone or computer. So now you have to respond to
Mm.
things at home on your computer or on your phone. You have to use this authenticator app through all this stuff. I mean, that was not the case a couple years ago, but now there's
Yeah.
so many. I mean, it just creeps in from all sides all the time. And you never flag it as all that important because it's just, you know, another small thing in the day. But
Yeah. Well, going back to pre-modern era, being a kid, I remember, and I'm sure you remember some of this too. I think this fits into your metaphor of like being in the intersection, is that as a kid, I remember being so bored, just nothing to do, and there's just nothing you could do. That you couldn't just pull out your phone and be entertained. That didn't exist. There wasn't even iPods. I mean, music was like you had to go buy a CD and put it in the CD player and sit there and listen to it. And you didn't have any money, so you had like four of them, and they would get scratched and ruined anyway. Like there was nothing to do, and that would motivate you eventually. The stuff that doesn't seem that interesting, you're like, well, I'm going to do it anyway because there's nothing to do. So your standards for something that is worth doing just drop dramatically because there's just nothing else.
right, and we would usually end up digging a hole in the backyard or something.
Yeah, we dug a hole to water many times. And so here's what's funny is that you remember that, and I
Yeah.
remember that too. It was a memorable thing. I remember discovering we would just go explore. We were lucky in this way in that we lived kind of out in the woods a little bit. There wasn't a lot around, so you could just kind of go wander off and find weird stuff in the semi woods. But I remember discovering we called it Trango Tower. I can't remember why we named it that, but we
I
did.
remember Trango Tower as
Yeah, of
well.
course.
Yes.
It was this was so dangerous, but it was this dead pine tree, huge pine tree that had died. So there's no branches left other than like kind of busted, half rotted stubs coming off. But where we lived, there were grapevines. I called them Florida grapevines, but they would just cover everything. These, I don't know if they're invasive or not. Probably not if they call them Florida grapevines, but they just cover everything. So this tree had been completely consumed in vines, but just because of the nature of the vines, there was like a foot or two gap between the trunk of the tree and then this enclosure of vines. So you, if you found this tree, you start at the base and you would climb it, but you're like climbing inside of a cave because it's just these thick vines everywhere till you get to the top that was high, way too high for small children to be climbing. And then you would like kind of come out of this canopy of vines and be up top this giant tower overlooking, you know, the countryside. And it was super cool.
There was also like adjacent smaller trees that had been covered in vines, and there were these pits of vines between the trees.
Mhm.
So you could go to the top of Trango Tower and jump off, fall into a pit, and then slowly fall to the ground in the embrace of these vines. It was extremely dangerous.
Oh yeah.
Uh,
There was also these other like big thick vines where a tree, like the vine would be wrapped around a tree and the tree would like collapse or something. So it would stretch this thing tight like a tightrope. And there was a couple of these just shooting off of Triangle Tower so you could like try to walk across it or monkey across it. Again, it's cool that we didn't die. But there was stuff like that that you discovered. And the reason that that discovery was made and why we were out there wandering around the woods, of course, a lot of this is kind of kid stuff. Most adults wouldn't be doing this no matter how bored they are. But still, you know, kids these days aren't doing that for the most part because they're entertained by their stuff. Like they aren't bored out of their minds and going out there and trying to seek things. And that is true of life now. And that I don't need to do anything new ever. There's no need and there's no desire necessarily unless I psych myself up to it because I am literally never bored ever.
and something like Trango Tower or the hundreds of other stories I could tell about the things we did. Like when we spent, this wasn't you, but like me and Bradley spent, I don't know, a couple weeks trying to push over this dead tree. We finally did, and then a rat came out of it, and I think it bit him. But like just
Not great.
no, but just random stories like that somehow
Yeah.
our life, you know? I mean, just minimal things that mattered even though they really shouldn't have.
Yeah.
And the things I don't look back on or don't care about at all is whatever I saw on Instagram yesterday.
Right.
I don't
Right.
care at all. You know, and
That's the point that I wanted to get to is that that stuff that you do that's not easy, that's not just kind of mindless entertainment that prevents you from being bored. I mean, yeah, sometimes it's a total waste and there's nothing interesting that happens at all. There's plenty of days that I don't remember because it was just boredom from dawn until dusk. But because of that motivation and desire to find something, you wind up looking in unusual places and doing unusual things, and those can actually turn out to be really rewarding and interesting. Those are the memories that I have of being a kid, the stuff that I remember and will remember for the rest of my life. And like you said, scrolling around on Instagram, I don't remember a single damn thing from that because it's trash. It doesn't matter.
right. We buried treasure in a peanut butter jar at mom and dad's house. We never dug
Yeah.
back up. I think there's money in a peanut butter jar somewhere. Um,
Well,
it
with
was like 20
inflation, it's
paces.
probably
Yeah.
not worth a lot. Should have buried some Bitcoin.
Anyway, yeah, I think the things that matter you end up finding from a place of exploration or boredom or whatever.
Yeah.
And there's no place for that um, in modern life, or very, very little. Um,
And
yeah, that's sad.
yeah. And I think too that the um I can't remember, maybe this was Cal Newport, Deep Work, great book, talking about how the things that are valuable, and this is like a business perspective, you know, if you're gonna, your career, the things that you do, the thing that's valuable is what he calls deep work. Being able to focus very deeply for long periods of time in order to make, you know, deep connections and do things that aren't trivial, that can't just be done by somebody who's just kind of showing up and doing whatever. And AI, I think, has made that ever more important in that AI is getting to the point where it can do almost all of the little things that don't require a lot of deep focus and deep thought. I see this in programming. Almost any random little thing that you need, I need a function that takes these things and does this thing and outputs this. AI can do that. Like, that is covered. What it can't do, at least for now, fingers crossed, is the really deep stuff. So the value as a human programmer is the deep work, 100%. And not that we're necessarily talking about work here, but the stuff that is rewarding to you as a person requires some depth. I think it requires some focus and persistence and willingness to spend a lot of time just looking and exploring. And I mean, why you guys spent 2 weeks pushing over a tree stump, I don't know, but I've done similar things as a kid too. And yeah, as stupid as that is, probably a pretty incredible sense of accomplishment when you finally do. And that's very memorable. And it's good that Bradley didn't get rabies.
Right.
That was
Well,
lucky.
if I'm remembering it right. No, it was sort of in the swamp. It was just this big
Yeah.
dead tree, and we're like, what if we push it over? And I think Timothy was probably there. A couple other people were there. But yeah, we worked really hard to push this thing over because we're young boys that thrive on destruction, I guess. And we finally push it over. A rat comes out. I'm pretty sure it bit Bradley. And then we were sad because we had, I don't know, destroyed this tree that I don't know. Uh, but for some reason, I guess that stayed with me.
I
Um,
remember we had built a tree fort, or yeah, a tree fort, and we were thinking, oh, we have to defend it. We got to build booby traps around it.
oh, yeah.
And so we tried a bunch of things, and eventually we like hauled a tree trunk, like a big heavy log, up into the tree, and then somehow rigged up like a tripwire out of vines and whatnot to where
Mm-hmm.
if you ran into it, this log fell down and killed you. And I remember, I think it was mom or dad came out and were like, no, you can't just kill someone. And we had to take that down. But anyway, yeah, it's surprising what you can come up with.
Well, I was the victim of a lot of those booby traps that you and Wesley made. So,
Yeah, you had the
um,
unfortunate status of being younger.
yeah, I didn't get smashed by a big log though. So
Yeah, that
thanks,
got
mom and
shut
dad.
down before it like really got brought into action. That would have killed someone for sure.
Anyway, don't get that bored where you start planning to kill
Right,
people.
right.
Uh, okay, so what do we do?
Well, yeah. Well, okay, first let's before we get into what we do, let's come to an agreement here on the value or lack of value of boredom because we at least at the start we're kind of disagreeing here. So what do you like, how bored should you be? How often? How much? Is it necessary? I mean, what do you think?
I think the only thing I was trying to get across is that I don't know, people sort of worship the word boredom.
Hmm.
But if you really think about it, it's like, well, you don't really want to just be bored all the time. Like, that's not, you know. But if you view it through the lens of when you are bored or when you're doing a lower entertainment level activity, whatever, you are making yourself stronger and healthier um, for when you do the more important, more focused activities that
Yeah.
you need and want to do. So if you think about it like that, it's beneficial. However, I I guess that if you look at the positives or the things that you really want out of life and out of boredom or whatever, they are those stories that we have. Um,
Hmm.
they're the things that matter. And I would say that when we were climbing Trango Tower and jumping off and pushing trees over and whatever, having or living life, I would not say that those times we were bored. We ended up there because we were bored in the first place. I don't know. And I think defining it exactly is maybe just kind of annoying. But yeah, I think boredom is important because it could lead to something very meaningful and yeah. But And I guess you are right. The act of boredom is useful in itself. But the things that I sort of focused on were kind of what happens after you are bored when you
Yeah.
start exploring and the things you find. So I guess there's value on both. Um, but yeah,
Yeah. The way I think I would lay it out is that, again, I don't worship boredom either. We're reminiscing about the cool things we wound up doing out of boredom. And that's awesome. That's like a major upside. But I also remember just there were some days so bored and it sucked. Like what you wouldn't ask a kid who's been bored for the past 4 hours, "Hey, are you feeling great? Are you loving life?" They're like, "No, I'm bored out of my mind. This sucks. Give me something to do. This is terrible. I hate it." Uh, there's not it's not like boredom leads to euphoria necessarily. So to me, the way I would think about it is one, and I think about this a lot now. I try to recognize this in myself all the time is that what is my baseline level of stimulation craving? Where is that at right now? I can be in a really good headspace, feel very calm and focused and able to pay attention to things that I want to pay attention to. And that can go on for, let's say, a week. And then within a day or two, if I start doing things that I know are going to move that needle or change my level of stimulation craving, like, scrolling and whatnot, within a day or two, it can be dramatically different where I can't comfortably sit down and do those things anymore. I mean, that I'm become very aware of that. And that doesn't mean that it's solved. It's still very tempting and easy to wind up doing those things that screw up that stimulation level. Probably should come up with a better word for it, but whatever, you get it. The, baseline dopamine, if you want to try and think of it that way. But that to me is incredibly important. It's important to the point where if it's too high, if I've been doing too much of that stuff, I can't do those things anymore. I can't sit down and read a book. I won't focus on it. I can't focus on it. I read a few pages and then my mind just starts to wander, or I just feel uncomfortable the whole time. I mean, that is a really important thing that is not appreciated often, that I think we all should be paying a lot of attention to. And boredom is not necessarily the cure to that. I do think it's very helpful, or can be helpful. If you're never bored, you're probably not lowering that level of stimulation very much. But again, low key activities, things that are very linear and focused for a long period of time, like you can get there that way. But to me, that's super key, and boredom is a part of that puzzle. The other thing, though, is that the other side of boredom is having some time where your mind is not occupied by something external. And that I really think is important as well. I think there are connections that get made. People always say they have their best ideas in the shower. It's not because of the shower. It's because you don't have your phone in there. You're just doing nothing. And so you get all these great ideas in the shower. It's just because you're stopped and you're still for a minute. And it doesn't have to just be the shower. It could be other times too. That's why. And that's a very important thing. Not that you need to be doing that all day long, but there needs to be moments like that. You need to be able to make connections in your brain where you don't have something in front of you occupying your attention. So the boredom, I think, fits into there. It's not the be all end all. You don't need to spend 3 hours being bored out of your mind every day, but I think you should be bored sometimes for brief amounts of time. And above all else, you really want that stimulation craving level to be very low, because otherwise you can't focus and you can't spend the time on things that are actually valuable. You wind up just seeking novelty all the time that just you never even remember it. It doesn't mean anything. It's just trash. Okay, what do you do?
well, a couple of things that have worked or are working for me. Okay, so my computer shuts off. That's been wonderful. Switching to a light phone,
Mm-hmm.
highly suggest figuring something out similar to that. Although I've also completely edited my smartphone
Hmm.
to the point where there is nothing fun on there. And doing that has freed up a lot of time for me to think. Um, I mean, it's a hard thing to do. All of these restrictions that you can put on yourself, eventually they sort of bleed back, or they go right back. Um,
Hmm.
I don't know. What are some things that you do?
I mean, I know I've used this example a lot, but I think of it as following a very similar trajectory to food and diet, in that, we for a while we were really kind of making fun of Americans, the Western diet, how the American diet was so bad, but it's becoming pretty clear that basically every country is headed in the same direction, and it's really nothing in particular about American food. Uh, it's that food used to be very restricted. There was only so many things you had access to eat. They tended to be, less calorie dense and harder to get, whatever. But we get more and more kinds of food that are engineered to be very hyper palatable, very good to eat and not tiring to eat. You can just eat an entire bag of potato chips because the mouthfeel is so good, the salt level is perfect, the everything, right? So the types of food just gets bigger and bigger, more and more appealing, becomes more and more available. There's, we live in an environment where food is unlimited, and it's evolved well beyond what it used to. And that is just happening everywhere. And the bad effects of that are becoming incredibly apparent. The lifetime risk of diabetes now, at least for someone in the US, is like 50%, meaning like half of people are going to get type 2 diabetes as we move into the future, which is insane and incredibly damaging to your health. Very dangerous. Uh, so that's food. That's what happens. There's no particular food. People argue all about sugar, about fat, about salt, about carbs, about refined carbs. All, like, none of that really matters. What really matters is that food has just evolved to this point where if you just let yourself eat what's there, you're going to be unhealthy unless you are a bit of an outlier genetically or behaviorally. For the vast majority of people, if you just eat whatever you want, you're going to be very unhealthy. Uh, and we are on the same trajectory for what you do with your mind. It used to be, like we're talking about, you didn't choose to be bored, you were bored because you had no choice. So your mind had to throttle down. It didn't, you just, it had to, because that was the environment that you lived in. But now that is not the case. And it's not just that there's more things that are more entertaining. It's not just that, hey, now the household can own more than 2 books. It's we're inventing things that are newer, that are designed to be more and more stimulating and more accessible. I mean, this stuff is in your pocket, in your phone. It unlocks just by looking at it. You tap on an icon and it's there and it's in your face. Like, it's incredible how far we've come in the science of making you stimulated all the time, every second. I mean, the Apple Vision Pro is coming, and one of the things that we discussed there is that now you're going to be able to walk around and do normal stuff like folding laundry with YouTube blaring in your face, in, picture in picture in your life. I mean, that's what they're after. So it's going to continue to get worse, if you can believe it. And there's going to be something that comes after TikTok that is even more exciting. Like, we are living in that world, and just because it's super common and normal does not mean that it's okay or that it's good for you. In the same sense that just because half of people are going to get type 2 diabetes doesn't mean it's okay now. It still sucks. There's still some, I mean, you can lose limbs. Your risk of heart attack is like doubled. I mean, it's really bad. And that's the case for this stuff too. So I know we're trying to talk about solutions here. The only the only way to, at least in my mind, the only way to eat healthily in the current environment, which is very unhealthy, is to put up barriers and find the restrictions that you need or the eating patterns that you need to be able to eat healthily, because the environment is not designed for that. It is designed for you to be able to eat all the time as much as you want. And I think for the mental stimulation part of it, you have to take the same approach. If you just say, I'm just going to do whatever, that's normal, that's what everyone else is doing, then you're going to suffer some ill effects. And you may not even realize it, probably don't realize it. We really were shocked, did not realize how big of a deal using your phone all the time was until we stopped. And then it's this revelation of, oh my God, this is so different. The way my mind works is so different. Within a day or two, you're thinking in a completely different way just from putting the phone away. It's crazy. So people don't even realize. And I think we're getting there, but you have to erect barriers and intentionally develop patterns of behavior that don't just follow that, I'm just going to do whatever is presented to me, because it's really unhealthy.
Yeah, this, you know, I can say things like, "Oh, have your computer shut off," or put your phone down, or plug it in, or whatever, or delete apps. It almost doesn't matter. The thing that has been frustrating me for the last couple years is this exact problem: is that all of the trends, the society, everything, just like food, um, it is completely working against all the things that I've always treasured and valued in my
Yep.
life. As an artist, musician, the things I really care about are the feelings and thoughts that I have and how to put those into music and art. And that's what I've treasured my whole life. And weirdly, in the last decade or so, the whole planet seems to be running straight for everything that demolishes all the things that I care about. Now,
Yeah.
that makes me sound like an old person or a complaining, senile old man or whatever. But I mean, if you just look at AI art, I mean, it's like, hey, we don't even have to think anymore, guys. Just type it in and it happens. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, well, okay, cool, but you're destroying the things that actually mattered in the first place. So cool, you can make more money, you can be more efficient, whatever, but the things that actually matter, you are destroying. It's going everywhere into every facet of my life, and everyone's lives. And many people are so excited about that. And it's not like I hate people for being excited for new technology or whatever, but there's so little attention given to the absolute complete destruction of the human existence. So suggesting little things like, "Oh, have your computer shut off," or "Put your phone down for 30 minutes a day," it's a joke. And I'm just so extremely disappointed in all of humanity, and where we are headed. And I know there's also a lot of wonderful things that are changing and happening, and people are starting to talk about this stuff. So it's not like I'm completely a cynic. But as a whole, I am a little terrified about where we're headed. And the fact that you have to fight so hard just to get half an hour of a time where you might start to think, to feel bored for 15, 30 minutes, whatever. You have to fight so hard to get that. That's a heartbreaking thing. Um, yeah. Say goodbye to the meaningful memories and life experiences and go sit on your phone and look through TikTok or Instagram or watch something else on Netflix. I mean, it's just sad. Um,
Well, okay, just to try and provide a counter argument
Please
to
do.
your
Go for it.
incredibly dark take on humanity and life, which I agree with. I completely agree with. To draw the comparison with the health stuff, thinking
But
about the implications of potentially half of people having type 2 diabetes, just to identify one aspect of the problem, is terrifying. I mean, the in the US, our healthcare system sucks to begin with. It is not even remotely prepared to deal with that as we're headed there. And the line has not changed. It's not just staying bad, it's getting worse. there's no improvement, not even close to improvement. It's just getting worse and worse, and that's an awful thing. But as an individual, you do have some agency. You can keep yourself healthy. It's difficult. It's more difficult than it used to be because we are living in this environment. If it wasn't difficult, we wouldn't have this problem. But it is something that you can do as an individual. And it amounts to a bunch of small things that don't feel like that big of a deal. You can get your energy intake expenditure into balance. You can do that. And it's not by doing this Herculean task that's super hard. It's not like having a baby. It's making a bunch of small choices and changing the environment that you're in, like your immediate environment, the food that's in your house, when you eat, what those habits are. You can make all these little adjustments. And yes, it's very hard to get them to stick, but in part, that's because they just don't feel like that big of a deal. Where you think, I'm going to stop eating at 8 instead of at 10 right before I go to bed. But then you're like, it's 8:30, it's not that big of a deal, or whatever, it's 8:45, I don't care. What's the difference? And it doesn't feel like that big of a deal, but that is one of the things that factors into you being a healthy eater versus somebody who is not a healthy eater. I mean, it matters, and that stuff, it works if it's all in the right place and you're able to keep it there. It can change the trajectory of your life. And by this same token, this, like having your computer shut off at 9 at night, you've said several times that that has made a huge difference in your life. And it's a small thing seemingly, and yes, you could get around it, but it matters. And if you put enough things in place, like you use this stupid light phone, and I mean, I say stupid because it just can't do much, right? But you use that, you have the computer stuff, and eventually you get into a place where like, hey, you're doing all right and not having to deal with this constant level of distraction and attention stealing. So it is doable as an individual. Humanity wise, things are going to get way, way worse, and it's actually going to be terrible. And there's all kinds of things to talk about there. Suicide rates are going up, and depression, anxiety are like off the charts. And this is at least a major contributor. That's super depressing and awful. And that's not going to change for a long time, if ever.
So the conclusion is you have to do it yourself.
Yeah.
And the positive is that there are tools out there to help you do these things. But the other negative thing is that it is going, it has been, and it's increasing, but it is a constant battle to fight for these things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess it boils down to the person, because the actual environment of the society that we all live in is not going to grant you any benefits in this area.
No, it is actively working against you, and it is going to remain that way. It sucks, but it is. So take care of yourself.